to sign a petition and to basically just, you know, it'll be interesting to see if an outside community agency like a charter school that has success can have a hostile takeover of a school.
Mm-hmm.
Similarly, you have in Colorado, actually, there's this interesting case that just came up where there's all these developers that are building these huge, you know, new communities, and they happen to be in a school district that's really low performing, and the schools really are terrible. And so the developers decided that they would just circumvent the district and they would build their own private school system entirely for all of their new homeowners. And they're talking about something like 60 private schools that would be part of this development and be supported by the families that live there. And they're trying to get some public funding too, which, you know, seems the private people always want government funding as well. But it is interesting how often people in small instances are trying to circumvent the large public monopoly.
Well, there's two big points that you brought up there. One was where they have this was a private organization attempting to take over the school, low-performing school district. So this was, and I like that, the idea that instead of blaming the community for the bad schools, to say, oh, these people in this neighborhood are just bad, maybe it's the government, maybe it's the school, maybe it's the system, instead of the other point of view, which is always, let's point the finger at the community, oh, that's just a bad neighborhood, you know, which I don't think is the case, and I'm not willing to do. And the other thing that I wanted to talk about, I think, was, is there a danger to this public funding? I mean, won't that just turn? There's two instances you described. There's one is where their community, they were building new homes. They wanted to build some schools that would be partially funded by the government. Then, they were talking before about the scholarships to the private schools coming from the government, which is just basically taking the money that you would be giving to the school and giving it to the parents, and then they can go shop around, hopefully, for a private school. Now, in both those instances, isn't there a danger with this public funding that we are going to take the private schools or the new forming private schools that are partially publicly funded and just turn them into more government schools with the same problems?
Right. You know, Mark, there's a lot of angst about that, and especially within the libertarian community, people really, they get caught up on definitions like tax credits are better because it doesn't come from the public, it's keeping your own money, and then you can give out scholarships versus vouchers versus charter schools that are even more heavily regulated where they have to follow, you know, they actually are public schools. But, you know, it's a $60 to $200 billion a year industry, depending on, you know, whose figures you want to look at. And for us here at the Reason Foundation, and for me in particular, you know, all markets have constraints. Even purely private schools now must abide by all kinds of health and safety regulations. The government tells them that they have to check their employees to make sure they're not child molesters. They tell them that the swing set has to be 40 feet from the concrete. They tell them that they can't, you know, have home-baked goods in the school, even if it's a private school in California. So, you know, there's all kinds of rules and regulations. You have to be ever vigilant. I mean, private schools are already heavily regulated. Anybody that tells you they're not are crazy. I mean, private universities, private schools, there's all kinds of government rules that they have to follow now. So it's just a continuum of, if you look at Marshall Fritz, the guy that runs the separation of school and state, on his end of the continuum, he wants a private market for education and no government involvement. Of course, we all want that, right? I mean, we'd love to have that and get to that end point. But the question is, the bottom line is, when the money follows the child, if you can break up that $60, $200 billion, however you can, and you can attach that money to the backs of children, and then make public, private, nonprofit schools compete for that money, and those kids have the right of exit, that is much more key than worrying about how regulated private schools must become. That's really the bottom line, is you have to have free movement between schools. If you think of the university system, where even if you have a Pell Grant or a government subsidy, you know, the government doesn't say you have to take your Pell Grant to, you know, to UCLA or to, you know, Biola University, a religious school. They give you, you know, the subsidy, and then it's still, the universities compete in a private market. And, you know, there's nonprofit schools like the University of Phoenix versus, you know, very religious schools like the University of San Diego. And they're all competing for that money. And I think if we can get a public education K-12 system that's modeled after, you know, the competition that goes on in our higher education system, that will still be a true market. Because, you know, the idea that there's any industry or sector that the government's not going to have rules and try to regulate. You know, even...
So what you're saying is, let's not look a gift horse in the mouth.
Right.
Anytime we can get less regulation, anytime we can take a step and give parents more options for education for their kids, that's better. And also, we're not going to get there overnight. We're not going to take all of this money away from the government overnight. Hopefully, we can chip away at it, and hopefully, over time, we can give parents, especially in low-income neighborhoods where we have a lot of failing schools and a lot lower literacy rates for the kids, hopefully more options, and that can help solve some of those problems. And when we get some of these options, as we've seen with the charter schools, homeschooling, and some of the other things you've been talking about, do we have any statistics showing is this able to raise literacy rates and raise the test scores of the people in those neighborhoods?
I mean, there's a lot of economic data, and Carolyn Hawksby, who hails out of Harvard, has probably done the most work here. But basically her work shows that this competition lifts all boats. That not only do the kids that actually get the charter school or the private scholarship perform better, but the schools that are stuck, that don't get to the kids that don't get to exercise their choice, that are still in the public schools, perform better over time too. And in many cases, the city of Philadelphia, for example, they contracted out 50 of their lowest performing schools to private and nonprofit providers like universities and Edison schools, and they're in the 7th year, I think, of this experiment, and they keep adding more schools that get to be managed by someone besides the public school. And they've had 7 years of test score improvement every year. And not only has the students improved, but the public schools have been emulating the technology. So for instance, Edison uses a benchmarking system where, you know, they don't wait till the end of the year for a standardized test. They test kids as they go along, and then they target, like if they're low, say in you know, their multiplication proficiency for math, then they give that kid extra help on multiplication problems, so that later when they take a standardized test, they've been focusing on what the deficits are for the individual child, which is, you know, what charter schools do, is they really focus in on the individual child and try to change the curriculum for that child's deficits. And so then the school district of Philadelphia adapted their own benchmarking system from one of the big standards testing companies and got them to write a program just for them that was very similar to the Edison program. And now they're benchmarking all their kids to see what their deficits are throughout the whole school system. They never would have done that if they didn't see Edison schools do that.
Right, so that's the benefit of having competition, is that it's also going to raise the awareness of the public schools about how much better they need to be doing.
Right.
So they're going to, all of this is basically it's putting the public schools on notice in a lot of ways that improve or go the way of the dodo bird.
Exactly. And, you know, on just that note, I think Detroit public schools is a perfect example of that. They've tried to make changes, but in the last 5 years they've lost about 70,000 kids